History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am so happy to be joined by Shara Moon, author of the novel Let Us March On. Shara, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin, for having me.
Well, let's start with Lizzie McDuffie. Who is she, and why did you write a novel about her?
So, Lizzie McDuffie, Elizabeth McDuffie, was FDR's maid for the entirety of his presidency. She had joined her husband, who was FDR's actual valet, even before the presidency. And she joined the White House working with the Roosevelts. And for somehow it like evolved from her being maid to her being confidant to her now campaigning for him and feeling like he really was the man to lead the country and convincing a lot of African Americans at the time to kind of transition from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, which, as you know, a lot of African Americans were Republican at the time because of Lincoln and the emancipation. And so she like really believed in him, believed that he was the guy for the job, but she also felt that there were issues in the African American community that weren't really being addressed. And so she leveraged her position in the White House to get those issues in front of the president and made a lot of difference.
Can you give us a little bit of historical context? This is before the Civil Rights Movement, and it's after the amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th amendments, and where were civil rights at that time? Of course, the country was steeped in a depression, but certainly that doesn't put a pause on things that, human rights. So can you talk about what the context was in that regard?
In that time, it was, I think, like I like to put it, like it was almost like it was like she was one of the many that were spearheading the civil rights movement. I think a lot of people think it started in the 60s because it, had a lot of impact at that time and a lot more voices and marches and, a lot more change happened during the 60s, 50s, and 60s. But even in the 30s and the 20s and earlier, there were a lot of organizations, NAACP, a lot of voices that were trying to put out there that we still need rights. Segregation isn't right. There's too many lynchings happening in the country. Like we need an anti-lynching law. So it was almost I think the start really of kicking off the civil rights movement.
So you talked about Lizzie being FDR's maid, but certainly a lot went on in her life leading up to that. Can you give us a little more background about who she was growing up, her family history, and how she came to be in that position?
Yeah, so she grew up in Atlanta. Um, Very, I think, modest beginnings. Her parents were actually born into slavery, but they were young enough at the time to have gotten, gotten in the right before emancipation or around emancipation. And when slavery ended, a lot of African Americans found themselves as like sharecroppers, farmers, doing very like domestic labor work. But her mother and her parents really believed in education, so she went to school. She went as far up to as they say college, but when I really delved deep into it, I think it was more like high school or like the beginnings of college. She went pretty far though for you know an African American woman growing up in the South. But it being the South, it being, the times that they were living in, she really couldn't find work. And so she kind of started off as a maid, even though she was very much educated. But she started off as a maid, a nursemaid for a really prominent family in Atlanta, worked for them for about 20, 25 years. And until she went to work for the Roosevelts. So she's very loyal, but domestic work had been the core of her life.
Now, can you talk more about the relationship she was able to develop, her and her husband, with FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, and the impact that relationship was able to have on real policy?
I think it's the I think because she had the opportunity to really kind of work with him in an intimate setting, her husband being his valet, her being allowed in his bedroom. I think she was, from what I remember, the only maid allowed to clean his bedroom. And so she had a lot of opportunity to interact with him, to help him in his day to day, help her husband, be alongside him to help the president. And I think that just kind of build a sort of intimacy that led to a closeness and a mutual respect between them. And she had a really great relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt as well. And I think their relationship just kind of really fueled that. He trusted what she had to say, didn't come from a place of anger or resentment or anything. It was, this is what's really happening, and someone needs to pay attention about it. And I think because he trusted her enough, he paid attention to what she had to say, and it led to policies being made. It led to him looking into issues that were being kept away from him.
I have a couple questions about, well, your interest in this history first. I'd like to know more about how you discovered her story and came to write about it. I'm also curious to know how much is out there. We had talked briefly about her memoir, which I think was in Ebony magazine. Have there been, how much else is out there when you're doing your research written up, about Lizzie McDuffie?
I think there's a lot more now available to the public about her. At the time of my research, it was all of her, like her collection, they call it the McDuffie collection, is in the Robert Woodruff Archive Library in Atlanta. And I got the opportunity to go in. This was in the middle of the pandemic, and they allowed me to sit in their archive library and just sift through all of her actual documents, photos, artifacts, and things like that. So those were great to see. I got to hold her manuscript. But then a couple years later, I found out they digitized a lot of that stuff. So now it's online, and anyone can just go on their website and look up the McDuffie collection, and you can go and see her memoir. You can look through the photos and the letters and correspondence that she got. So a lot more is available, which I think is amazing and great, because she was a very fascinating woman. How I got um how I landed on her story was almost by accident. I was actually in the middle of writing another book. And in that book, I needed someone who had an in the White House. And not only an in the White House, but who was also going to be willing to be empathetic to the issues that my character at the time wanted to present to the president or the first lady. She really didn't care. She just needed someone to get her inside the White House and in front of these, powerful people. And so, author friend of mine, Kaya Alderson, I tell this story all the time because she was amazing. I kind of was, sharing this with my author friends, and she sent me an article about Lizzie McDuffie. And, she was like, oh, maybe she would be a great plug, in your story about, like the person, she was the perfect person I could use in that book to get my character inside the White House. But the more I read about Lizzie McDuffie, the more I felt like she needs her own story. This woman's amazing. And so from there, I pitched it to my agent, and the rest is history.
That's amazing. Did anything ever come of the other project you were working on?
Actually, that's the second book I'm working on
Okay,
now.
nice.
Yeah.
We had briefly talked, and I might have been before we started recording, about the transition for Black Americans away from the Republican Party and toward the Democratic Party. Can you talk a little bit about that and Lizzie's involvement in that?
I think it was very subtle. Even she makes it very subtle in her memoir, but there is a line in her memoir that I found funny because she talks about how, this is during the campaign, the first campaign that FDR had for the presidency, and they hadn't expected it. When her husband went to work for FDR, he just wanted to break from being a barber, and he thought he's just going to be a valet for this governor and life will be a little bit easy for him. But, as FDR really took the campaign serious and really saw his chance of becoming president, everyone was really excited. But she mentions, like, I don't know what my husband's thinking about, like, what kind of good Republican would work for a Democrat. And so in the beginning, she, just kind of felt like this was a job, but they, didn't really follow the Democrats because they were good Republicans. They were the party of Lincoln. But then the more she knew about FDR, the more she got to understand him. He wasn't like the typical Southern Democrats. He was from New York and he had different views from a lot of them. And I think that's when for them, they realized, yeah, we're loyal to this party, the Republican Party, but they're not doing anything for our community. And this guy is looking at the country as everyone and not just some of the citizens. And so she felt in particular that, they as a community needed to support a president that's going to listen to their issues and enact change for them.
Well, we've talked a lot about Lizzie, and rightfully so, but let's talk about you. Tell me about your background as a writer and how you came to be a writer of historical fiction.
Okay, so I've actually written before. I've written under a pen name. I wrote romance at the time, but in my romance writing, I wrote a variety of genres or subgenres. I wrote contemporary, suspense, and historical romance. And I was kind of getting into a place where, as I was getting older and life was changing, the industry was changing, and so was my, I guess, I don't know how to put it because it's like I love being a writer. I still am a writer, but I felt like I was kind of getting disenchanted with romance, which was weird because I was in the middle of like getting married and all the things. And in my heart of hearts, I'm always going to be a romance reader, but I think I wanted to evolve into something else. And so I love history. I've always loved history since high school. And I got the opportunity to talk to my agent about historical fiction, not necessarily historical romance. And we got to talking about what that would look like, what I was interested in, the things I was interested in writing, and we just kind of carried the conversation forward. And she was just as enthusiastic about the ideas that I was sharing with her, and I got more excited about them because I feel like Black women in history or historical fiction featuring Black characters is very underrepresented in publishing. And so it was the exciting time for me to kind of pitch these stories that a lot of us don't know about, still don't know about, and see if, like they can get published and go out there and like become bigger than what they currently were.
Well, let's talk a little more about that because it's one thing to have an interest in the history, and even one thing to have a background writing fiction or writing romance. What were some of the challenges of writing historical fiction that maybe you didn't expect or foresee?
I think the main challenge for me was not turning it into a history lesson because it's like a fine dance of like sharing just enough history to keep people engaged and interested, but not dominate. Like I'm not writing a textbook, and I don't want to bore people with like the historical stuff. It's almost like you have to have this great way of weaving the story with the facts and the fiction and not bog it down with too much research, because as a fiction writer, historical fiction writer, especially, a lot of research happens before the writing even starts. And when you have all this, I have my computer, probably the bulk of my files is all the research. And then it's boiled down to like a 90,000 word novel. It's like, you have all this stuff you want to say, you want to share, but not all of it gets in the book.
So, did you find yourself having to cut a lot, or were you able to kind of catch yourself before doing some information dumps?
Well, I think I was catching myself, and then my editor got a hold of my manuscript, and we chopped a lot off in the beginning, which I really was trying to hold on to. But to her point, it made the story stronger. She's like, the story really starts here, so we need to kind of like kickstart it here in this place and time. So I lost about 5 chapters, the first 5 chapters of the book. And then, as we're going through, like a lot of the things that she kept, the side notes in my manuscript was, how does this like relate to the story? How does this relate to Lizzie? Like, why is this important? And so that's what kind of helped with keeping that frame of mind of, okay, I have all this history and this research, but I still got to make sure it ties back and it's relevant to the story right now.
I saw on your Instagram that you went up to New York and visited
I
HarperCollins.
did. I
Uh,
did.
tell me about that experience.
Now that was pretty cool because I've never gotten to, I mean, well, this was my first traditionally published book, so I never really got to meet any, publisher. But having gotten to meet her was great because we started talking about my project back in 2021. It's 2025 now. Well, at the time it was 2024. And so I didn't realize, like, wow, a lot of time has passed. Like, you speak to this person on the phone, you do a couple Zoom calls, but getting to meet someone, getting to go to the actual place where your book baby is like coming alive was really unique. I just getting off the train, the first thing I saw was the New World Trade Center. I didn't know they were that close. And so, like, as I'm walking to the building, and this like very massive building, very impressive building is like looming above me, I was just like, wow, this is so cool. That's why I started recording. And then I get into the building, and there's like the lobby is surrounded by books, and they have this wall of books. And even like the floor above where we went to her office, there's more books. Like they really do a great job decorating the place with books, and just I don't know, like it gives you like this, like if you're a book nerd, it was like a book nerd's dream.
Sounds very exciting. What would you say to any writers out there listening who's like, I want that experience, like about the journey to get there?
God, that's a tough one because like it's a long journey, It's not like, I mean, I think in hindsight, I did get lucky in how I got here, but I also was writing romance for 12 years before I got here, and then I got here and I have been doing this for 4 years now. And so I think it's persistence, passion, and like just kind of staying true to what you want to write and what you want to do. I mean, it's gonna be highs and lows, probably more lows, but if you stay consistent and stay motivated, I think a lot of writers will get to realize what it is that they want out of their career.
And now that this book, Let Us March On, is finally going to be released, what are you most excited for readers to take away from it?
um, so many things. I think like the one part I just want them to realize that how amazing this lady is. I want them to flood the Woodruff library system and go and check out her collection. I want her to kind of become a household name, I want them to realize like there's this hidden figure in history that really needs a place, in the history books. And at the same time, I want them to realize too that at the time, Lizzie joined the White House, the world was not in a good place. The country, even, we were in the Depression, economically, we weren't doing so good, like socially, civically, all the things. And we're, like what, 90 years later, we're kind of still in that same space. And so it's like, just to kind of stay hopeful, stay inspired that there's always going to be people fighting for the right side of history. And stay mindful that we still have a lot to do, and just stay hopeful that we're going to get there.
Yeah, I think that's a great message. There's certainly a lot of disillusionment going on. As we speak now, it's mid-January. Um, I think that's really important to show readers the history, and disillusionment isn't new kind of a thing.
Right. Right. Like we've fought this fight before. We're still fighting it. Country goes through highs and lows like it had back in 1933, 1934, and um 2025, we're pretty much in, a similar space, still fighting for, social justice, civil rights, human rights, and just like, trying not to like get back to that place where people couldn't afford to live, and people were so disheartened and felt alone. And I know the book is a lot about Lizzie, and I love that I got to tell her story. But for me, also, it was great to see what great impact FDR made in the country as a president. I only knew very little of him, to be honest. I knew that he was the president. Everyone tried to keep his polio hush hush, and he was really running the country in a wheelchair, but no one wanted, the public to know this. But, for all of that, he really made a great impact. And so I can see why at the time, Americans were like, he needs to stay president. And it's just nice to see that at the end of the day you still have some people who are in politics and trying to do the right thing.
So it sounds like you are staying in that era. Can you tell us a little bit about what you are working on next?
Yeah, so the second book I'm working on is tentatively called Gold Star Mothers, and it's basically a book about a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. So it's a mother and a wife, so to speak, who are kind of in conflict because at the time, this is 1933, by the way, 1933, 1934, where the country had sponsored a pilgrimage to France for mothers who had lost their son in World War One. A lot of those soldiers had to get buried in France because it was just too much to bring them back and kind of do the burial. So there is to this day they still have this memorial and cemetery where a lot of those who fallen soldiers who died overseas are buried. So the War Department sponsored a pilgrimage, paying for these mothers to go. If the mother wasn't alive, the wives got to go. Well, in my story, I discovered that this pilgrimage was offered to Black mothers and widows as well, but it was a segregated trip. And this is where the conflict comes in because even at that time, true story, a lot of Black mothers were protesting the pilgrimage because they felt in a time like this is where segregation had no place in, and of course, with segregation, there was inequality. So as the white mothers got treated much nicer and voyaged much nicer, the Black mothers, didn't get that same treatment. And so in my story, the conflict is the mother is in that bandwagon of we need to protest this. This is not right. We need equal treatment. But the wife, the widow, she kind of doesn't care about any of that. She just wants the opportunity to go see her husband's final resting place and say her goodbyes. Unfortunately, because the mother is there, like still alive, she isn't extended an invitation. Um, and that's where the conflict is. The mother is protesting, so she might not go to the trip. So the wife, the widow, wants the ticket, but the mother is not going to relinquish the ticket because she wants to make a point. She wants to make things right. And so this is where they bump heads, and the conflict between them is intense because now you don't know what's going to happen between the two of them and how their relationship is going to go from here.
That sounds amazing. Like the all the elements you have coming together there, the father or the mother-daughter situation amidst the social injustice situation, and then kind of a like do the right thing protest, and like I'm invested, so I can't wait for that. That's
Yay.
great.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. It was funny because that was the first book that was supposed to kind of sort. That was the first book I pitched. But when my editor, when we talked about the two stories, she felt that Lizzie's story needed to come out first, and I agreed. And so this story has been brewing for a long time.
That's exciting. Well, Shara, congratulations on Let Us March On, and it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Colin.